Mhm. Greetings, greetings, one and all. My name is Aleema, and it is a great pleasure to be here this evening, chairing a very, very special talk as part of Freedom in the City Festival of Learning. For those of you who are just joining us, Freedom in the City is a 6-month series of events dedicated to spotlighting Fairfield House in Bath, the former residence of Emperor Haile Selassie and Empress Menen Asfa of Ethiopia. Part of acknowledging the history and the legacy of the emperor's time in Britain acknowledges the connections that were fostered among those who saw Ethiopia as a space from which liberation could be waged. There is perhaps no other movement that has centered the significance of Ethiopia than the Rastafari. In fact, an elder once told me that Rastafari can be seen as a river with many different currents, but all journeying towards liberation. The thread running throughout Rastafari is a thread that centers the teaching of Emperor Haile Selassie Jah Rastafari. So it is within this light that I introduce today's talk by the legendary Ras Shango Baku. The talk will be reasoning on the history and the theology of Rastafari from biblical prophecy to contemporary Rastafari organizing. And we'll end with a chance to open it up for further reasoning. So feel free to use the comment section to share any thoughts and to reflect. And you can also click on the questions tab to ask some questions throughout. I'll begin with introducing myself before welcoming Ras Shango. My name is Aleema. I am a historian and a curator with a particular focus on centering community knowledge as a way to repair histories subjected to colonial erasure. My current PhD at Warwick University documents a community-engaged history of Rastafari in Britain. The Rastafari have been subjected to many different caricatures, from criminals to peacemaking, weed smokers. Having been a part of the Rastafari tradition from birth, my research or life search is very much informed by a living history of Rastafari, one that seeks to bridge the gap between the struggles between, how we see ourselves and how others sees us. This living history brought me to activist, writer, and dramatist Ras Shango Baku. I first stumbled across Shango Baku after searching the digital archives of YouTube to find his infamous debate with the late Darcus Howe, prominent Rastafari organizer at the time. He took center stage and defended Rastafari in Britain and beyond. In one particular moment where he was questioned by Howe as to why he hasn't repatriated to Ethiopia, Ras Shango notably reminded us that repatriation isn't a simple thing where you can get up and go. It operates on multiple different levels. But beyond the activism, Ras Shango has created the necessary reference points for younger researchers to understand Rastafari outside of the popular stereotyping. In the 1980s, he founded and edited one of the first international Rastafari newspapers, Rastafari Speaks. The newspaper for me is very much an anthology into the global and interior experiences of Rastafari. In fact, it was in this newspaper that I actually stumbled across my dad, who, unbeknownst to me, is longtime friends with Ras Shango. So it sort of demonstrates a way in which this history has come in full circle. Ras Shango continues to show a commitment to doing. He continues his work as an international journalist and a spokesperson. He is the editor of Thunder magazine and voice of the Nyahbinghi National Councl. It is with great honor and great pleasure that I welcome Ras Shango Baku. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, my dear sister Aleema, for giving me such an illustrious background. Can you hear me? The talk faded, your voice faded for the last 20 seconds or so. I hope mine doesn't fade. I don't know if you can assure me that I'm being heard as well as seen at the moment.
We can hear you very well, Shango. Thank you very much. You're doing fantastic. Thank you very much. You don't need to, you just crack on. Blessings to you.
Yes. Okay. The history and theology of Rastafari Livity. It's a very broad and sweeping subject to deal with. Particularly, I think, because in Rastafari, history and theology are so closely connected that they're particularly, they can be seen as the same, actually. As one elder who we will talk about once said to me, there are two roads that lead to Rastafari. One is history and one is the Bible. And very often we use both of these to assert who we are or to find our position in life. Both through history, we see ourselves as very ancient, even though we are a modern so-called movement. And we tend to look at the Bible for inspiration because it is a historical document that speaks of all people and all things at some point. History-wise, most people see us as starting off in the 1930s with the coronation of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, who we see as our great guide, our God, our protector, our everything. The movement is in fact named after him. In his early time, he was known as Rastafari, until his coronation name became Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. So we are Rastafari, named after him. But I would like to go further, a bit further before 1930, and look at a philosophy or a way of thought called Ethiopianism. And as our dear chairperson said, you know, more than any other group of people, we have a link with Ethiopia that is real and lasting. Ethiopianism came to the fore in the late 18th and early 19th century. The world in turmoil. Even before the end of slavery, there was a feeling that change was afoot or at hand, and that things would change remarkably within the next decade, and certainly after centuries of forced slavery or enslavement, we would turn a corner and find freedom. So African descendants worldwide were looking at ways of liberation, ways of coming out from under the foot of the oppressor and finding ourselves again as a very special people. Ethiopianism came forward both in Southern Africa and North America via church religions mainly. We find that those who were seeking liberation looked towards that last bastion of African freedom, Ethiopia, that had never been conquered, that was mentioned in the Bible, one of the first countries mentioned in the Bible, and one that still exists today after so many millennia, and one that is very close to the heart of Rastafari, because we see His Imperial Majesty, Emperor of Ethiopia, as a redeeming force in our lives and the beginning of the movement in the modern day, as we have said. It is said that Ethiopian references in the Bible had a very liberating promise that contrasted with the indignities of plantation bondage, which we had suffered for centuries. So this was something to cling to remember, to investigate, to hold dear to our hearts, and to make us remember our former greatness long before the days of enslavement. Ethiopian references in the Bible had a liberatory promise. No less than 45 references to Ethiopia are listed in the Bible, most of them appearing in the Old Testament, such as Psalm 68, which is a famous psalm for Rastafari. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Verse 31, Psalm 68, often quoted by the eminent leader Marcus Garvey, who we will talk about. And again, are ye not children of the Ethiopians to me, O children of Israel, saith the Lord? That is from the prophet Amos, chapter 9, verse 7. And Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. Nahum 3, verse 9. References to Egypt, 786 in total, were also significant to Ethiopianists, who saw the Ethiopian throne as a connecting link to the ancient Israelites. Egypt as a cradle of civilization, and Africa in general as a primordial ancient homeland. So Rastafari as a liberation movement found a lot of solace, not just in His Imperial Majesty, Emperor of Ethiopia, but in these connections with the Bible, which heralded the ancient Israelites who he identified with, and therefore the coming out of the bondage of enslavement after the vicissitudes of the transatlantic trade meant a lot to us. And therefore we held closely to the biblical revelation of Rastafari in the times that we were perhaps the last to come out of enslavement, because we were a force that was against Babylon. And therefore we were seen as ultimately a slave rebellion that continued into the 20th century, burning down Babylon. We found that that system that had imposed enslavement on an African people for centuries was also one that was inimical to life itself and needed changing, vastly changing or destroying. So therefore the Rastafari came up with this ultimate thought that we not deal with Babylon. Babylon is confusion, Babylon is death, Babylon is exploitation, oppression, colonialism, and everything that is seen as oppressive to ordinary people in the world. So even today we fight against Babylon. We fight against Babylon inventions, Babylon thought, and Babylon moves generally in the world today. But we are not defined as a force against Babylon. We are a very positive movement that has changed the ideas and concepts of young and older generations to see that the world can be a place of peace, of equal rights and justice. And we have been for the past 80 years or more chanting down Babylon and chanting up peace and prosperity for mankind. Indeed, the first greetings of the elders in the 1930s was peace and love, brother man, sister. Peace and love was the codification of this new force that arose, as one say, in Jamaica particularly. But I think we should broaden that scope to include the Caribbean and further afield in Africa, North America, where the same aspirations were in the hearts of ones who were not perhaps Rastafari, but certainly had stirrings towards liberation. And these were, as we said, the Ethiopianists who came up in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. And in going before the 1930s, I would like to speak a bit about Ethiopianism as a happening that preempted Rastafari. It is said that the first enslaved Africans, or Africans who were enslaved, when they left the shores of Africa, already had Rastafari in their hearts. It was stirring towards a better life, a life that was not captive, but could express itself in its own terms. The spirit of Rastafari was even on the shores of Africa, West Africa particularly, from where we were taken in ships to the Caribbean, to Brazil, and to the Americas. There were preachers or eminent activists in the Caribbean in the days before Rastafari came to the fore. And among them were people like Robert Love from the Bahamas, who was an activist, again, championing, like Marcus Garvey did after him, the rights of African descendants. And there was George Liel, who was an emancipated, formerly enslaved person from USA who came to Jamaica after the War of Independence, along with Moses, a guy called Moses Baker, and George Lewis. And they began to try to proselytize or convert enslaved populace of Jamaica towards seeing themselves in a different light as ancient Israelites who were akin or who were connected to the early Ethiopians who brought civilization to the world. So there was this redemption movement that were happening and from that time. And this was, as we say, in the 1920s perhaps, before the proclamation of Rastafari came. We had people like Athley Rogers of Anguilla, who set up the Athley Constructive Church, which somehow found itself in South Africa, having branches. And William Athley Rogers from Anguilla in 1920s wrote the Holy Pibby, which was sometimes called the Black Man's Bible. And even though we were so disconnected and disenfranchised, somehow the Pibby found its way via activists from South Africa. There was a man called Sol Plaatje, Plaatje, Solomon Plaatje, who was one of the first secretaries of the ANC. Before it came into fruition, it was the National Council of South Africa. And even there, the feeling towards Ethiopianism was flourishing. And it was probably someone like Plaatje, an activist, a writer, a historian, a dramatist, as I say, the first secretary of the ANC, who brought the Holy Pibby again in the 20s to the West, and through the connection with Panama to Jamaica. They say that the two greatest holes that were dug in the Earth's surface were the diamond mines of Kimberley and the Panama Canal, both employing swathes of Africans who were probably good at digging the earth, were very close to the earth and knew its secrets and could reveal them. So we find that these connections, even before modern times, between South Africa, the Caribbean, Central America, and North America existed even tenuously between those who were seeking the light of liberation after centuries of darkness. Robert Love was from Bahamas, and he was an activist. Somehow he published a paper called Jamaica Advocate. That means he must have lived there for some time. And he was what you call one of the first Pan-Africanists, alongside people like Sylvester Williams of Trinidad. In 1901, he held the first Pan-African conference in London, orchestrated it. So you have people like Rogers, Williams, Love, George Liel, who we spoke about, initiating he initiated the Ethiopian Baptist Church in 1874 in Jamaica. And you had even non-Africans like Reverend William Knibb, who again was a publisher of the Baptist Herald and the Friends of Africa newspaper. And later on, the first Anglican minister, Reverend William Gordon, who again was a freedom fighter and activist. So you see that theology, or the church, was very much impacting on the liberation movements that led up to the coronation of His Imperial Majesty in 1930. Marcus Garvey, that eminent activist who is still revered today, especially by the Rastafari movement, is said to have made a speech in which he said, "Look towards Africa." And this is disputed by some scholars. "When you see a black king crowned, know that the day of redemption is at hand." So this was the pointing finger towards Africa and towards Ethiopia, a prophecy of coronation that we should take into account. And as the times go by, there are people like John the Baptist and Elijah who are of the same ilk. They see the coming of the changing times, the Redeemer, as it were. And Marcus Garvey is seen by the Rastafari movement in this light as a John the Baptist pointing at the coming of Rastafari and his coronation in 1930, at which time the Redeemer would be with us, granting us that freedom of mind, that physical freedom as well, to become what we want to be. As Bob Marley said later on, we are who we are, you know, not who people want us to be. And Garvey can be mentioned among the forerunners of the movement, like Leonard Percival Howell, a very famous Rasta man who founded Pinnacle, one of the great foundations where the Rastafari movement began to find its feet, began to find its culture, its way of life, its manners. Leonard P. Howell. With him was sometime lieutenant called Robert Hines, again, who achieved fame by being one of the declarers. They declared the majesty of His Imperial Majesty, very often independently of each other in the first instance, before they came together. Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert was another. And what was interesting about these was the fact that they had spent long periods outside of Jamaica, famously in Central America, which we mentioned, the Panama Canal, etc. Archibald Dunkley, another one who was, like Hibbert, a member of Ethiopian Masonry, as it was known. This was perhaps how ancient knowledge was passed through African descendants from the ancient time to the present. And it's interesting that they were the first Masons as such, or not Freemasons, but dealers in stone, makers of pyramids, you know. And these are antecedents of the Rastafari movement. Howell, Hines, Hibbert, and Dunkley. They were the heads of organizations. They accumulated descendants or followers who became part of what later on were the houses of Rastafari, which we will speak of in general, because that's part of the history. And these forerunners began as street preachers, as they were known. In other words, they would stand on the corner and perhaps, like Sojourner Truth in days of old, ring a bell so that people would gather around them and they would spread the word of the Redeemer, that His Imperial Majesty of Ethiopia, recently coronated on the 30th of November, 1930, was indeed the Messiah returned, who had come to redeem African descendants from the woes and the troubles and the oppression that they had suffered for centuries. As we said, the greatest of these, perhaps, or the best known, or as a writer called Helen Lee says in her book, The First Rasta, was Howell. And I think she also made a film of the first Rasta. Howell had land in Sligo where he created a community of tradespeople, artists, protesters, people who were generally against the colonial state of Jamaica and who were looking for a new life. And they were, like Howell, perhaps adventurers, seamen who had traveled, men of a different disposition from what was accepted at the time, who sought an African existence, one that had a moral center to it, living in peace with each other, planting crops, because we have always been close to the earth. We are made from the earth, we remained with the vegetables, etc., abhorring meat and all those things because we found ourselves too close to the so-called beasts of the earth to eat their flesh. So most Rastas, even today, turn away from eating meat. Some eat fish, which is slightly different and less abominable, I suppose. But we were the first ecologists, as it were. We were the first ones who, without thinking of the planet as such, were deciding by our action to save it, by becoming farmers, by eating the fruit of the land and vegetarians rather than doing otherwise. So the 1930s saw that rise of the movement in the voice of these protagonists in Jamaica, who were, as I said, street preachers, joined each other later on, even though they found His Imperial Majesty in the pages of the Bible, independent of each other. Hines became Howell's lieutenant. Later on, he joined Dunkley, Archibald Dunkley's platform. Hibbert came from founded the Ethiopian Coptic Church, and he was of a slightly different persuasion from the others. He had spent a long time in Costa Rica from the age of 11. He had lived for 20 years in Central America. And it's interesting that these forerunners individually had spent time, like Marcus Garvey, in Central America, working for the United Fruit Company, which was, in those days, a way of gaining funds, getting out from the islands, going on work in Central America, in unbearable circumstances. By the time Marcus got there, he saw the swamps, the forests, the sometimes low esteem in which Caribbean workers were held by those managers. And he began, even in those days, in the before 1920 even, to publish in papers in Cologne and otherwise about the conditions that he saw those working under there. He was a manager. So again, we have these, as our chairperson said, these rivers that flow from so many different parts that come into the great sea, which we call Selassie, His Imperial Majesty. They come into Rastafari from many directions. Howell had seen, as a seaman, big changes in the world, the Russian Revolution, etc. He was a one-time member, as most of them were, of the UNIA, Garvey's United African Improvement Association. So there were those who were active in seeking betterment, and somehow their research took them to this realization that His Imperial Majesty was the returned Redeemer. But to look at the houses and the formation of the houses, which were sometimes called mansions, you know, not just houses, the mansions of Rastafari. Barnett, in his book on Rastafari, calls them almost second generation rather than first. People like Ras Bonages, the surnamed the Son of Thunder, or Sons of Thunder as they were called originally in the Bible, who perceived His Majesty again through the work of the Bible, through the words of the Bible, and started off, he is seen as the patriarch of the Nyahbinghi Mansion, one of the great houses of Rastafari. In the 40s, he formed the Youth Black Faith. They were like warriors fighting for Rastafari, fighting theoretically around the throne of Rastafari, which was thousands of miles away in Ethiopia, where perhaps the Italian press was already arraigned against him before they entered Ethiopia. He was already being vilified. And the Youth Black Faith were young men, perhaps in their 30s or so, who saw themselves as defenders of His Imperial Majesty, led by this great man, Ras Bonagees. And they wore black, and I think they carried cutlasses at some time. And it's strange that on the other front, you had the black shirts of Britain, who were on the side of Mussolini and who were fascists. So you had black against black, even in terms of apparel, if nothing else. And Bonagees lived right up until the year 2000, in which he transitioned, as we say. The Nyahbinghi house had been formed and spread around the world. In 1992, he went to Africa. Later on in 1996, he was in South Africa. He came to Britain in 1986, took part in a Caribbean gathering in Britain in those years. He toured the islands in the 1980s and recruited ones like Ras Tafari, who became one of his followers. He also has passed forward. So as well as his junior acolytes, Ras Ibu, Ras Ivai, Ras Ivil, three brothers who surrounded Bonagees from his early times. He had followers from University of the West Indies, because there was a famous paper that came out in 1960 that looked at the Rastafari movement. Eminent professors, M.G. Smith, Roy Augier, I think his name was, Augier, Rex Nettleford. There was a lot of unrest in Jamaica. 1960, people like Mortimer Planner went to UE and spoke to these eminent professors, asking them to write about Rastafari so that they could become better known in the broad-based community of Jamaica, who had seen them at first as black heart men who would steal away their children from them and perhaps eat them. So they would hold their children tight when they saw a Rasta man approaching and say, "Black heart man," and turn the minds of the people against this movement, which by then had taken on the appearance of locks and unshaven faces, because Africans were not supposed to perhaps shave their faces, but to be as natural as they were born. You know, we let our hair grow. We let our gardens grow. We let our vegetables grow. We did everything that was natural to man, rather than conform to the ways of Babylon, where you had to be what was early called a bald head, which meant that you had to shave your face, your hair off your head, etc., to conform to what Babylon termed civilized. Whereas the Rastafari was seen as backward, you know, harking back to the jungle, living in trees, etc., and all the different things, the aggressive hostile, violent, etc., and all these negative tendencies that were put on Rastafari as a stigma, initiated, of course, by the colonialists who wanted everyone to be subservient and continue, even after emancipation, to be as their masters wanted them to be. Which is why we say again, we refuse to be what they wanted us to be. We are who we are. That's the way we're going to be, as Bob says in his song. So there was the Nyahbinghi, which is seen as the first house. Sometimes they say all the other mansions came out of the first house. Then there's King Emmanuel, or Prince Emmanuel, formerly known as Charles Edward, who came from, I think, St. Thomas, and regarded as a Kumina person. Kumina being an ancient African form of religion tinged with Christianity, which preceded Rastafarianism, or Rastafari, because we don't like to use it as an ism. And in 1958, Prince Emmanuel, and Bonaji says, you know, he was one of those who used to come to his yard when it was famous for reasoning among all activists about Rastafari. In 1958, Prince Emmanuel held a great convention, island-wide, thousands, and it is remembered as the Great Convention of 1958, after which he formed the Ethio-African BIC, EABIC, with the main aim of return to Africa, and his descendants were called Bobo Shanti, as they wore hair wraps, robes. They sold coconut brooms in the early days to raise funds for their engagements, or woven mats, again from the coconut. And he set up a base in Bull Bay, 10 miles outside Kingston itself, again on a plot of land, perhaps similar to Pinnacle. I remember going to Bull Bay, Emmanuel's foundation, as a young Rastafari journalist, wanting to see this great man, Emmanuel, and meeting him, and going through the rituals of taking everything out of my pockets when I entered the gates, which were overwritten with so many ordination conventions, biblical scripts, warnings, etc., etc., turning to the east and saying a prayer. These were the rituals of entering the EABIC, the Bobo Shanti place in Bulbe, and speaking to Emmanuel, who turned out to be a very tall elder, charming, playful, and easy to talk to. And he spoke of His Imperial Majesty with reverence, even though he had promoted himself as the Black Christ. Among his followers, he was known as Emmanuel, Prince Emmanuel, later on King Emmanuel. And this was his mansion, the Ethiopian African Black International Congress, EABIC, which again gained that membership as a particular house of Emmanuel. Followers were from the islands. I remember meeting them in Trinidad. I met them in Africa as well, Ethiopia and Ghana. So the leaders created the houses, the mansions, and the mansions spread worldwide in time. Then there was the EWF, or there is the EWF, an activist called Mamie Richardson, a woman, Mamie Richardson, in 1955, brought word of the Ethiopian World Federation to Jamaica. This was formed by His Majesty's physician, Malaku Bayen, in 1937, when His Majesty was in exile in Britain. He was approached to give his blessing to the EWF, which had within it Garvey followers as well as Rastafari, and which was more or less taken over by the Rastafari movement as perhaps not a mansion, but certainly a grouping within the broader realm of Rastafari, where it remains till this day, despite having disputes and legal problems. Rastafari has never been a homogeneous unit with one head and one unified government. His Imperial Majesty is the leader, and perhaps we are all followers and children of him. So it is not strange that as children we sometimes find confusion between each other. Even as Christians too, with their many churches. And the mansions, there are 4 great mansions. The last is the 12 tribes of Israel, formed by Gad. He's known as Gadman, in 1968, based on the 12 tribes of Israel, where all members, depending on when they're born, are like the sons of Jacob. They can be Zebulun, they can be Judah, Simeon, etc., etc. And they have roles, they have associations with each other based on the original 12 tribes of Israel. And they too are written in portions of the Bible. And God took the liberty of naming them from a certain verse, which I can find at some point, that said, you will be as the 12 tribes, sitting as judges on the 12 tribes of Israel. And this became a very, again, different mansion in that they had dues. In other words, you had to pay your regular dues to the finance committee, and these dues were collected so as to send individuals who were ready to Ethiopia, as repatriation became one of the main intentions of all the houses. We recovered our African identity, but we were still not in Africa. Therefore, repatriation became one of the main causes of the houses, of the movement itself. It still is. And this was the beginning of the formation of the Shashamane situation, where we have Rastas who have returned to Ethiopia since the 60s and lived there, 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, some through various changes of government that have happened in Ethiopia. At one point you have the Derg taking over, and again you had a new government under the present president. You had different changes of government, and somehow with the great changes that went on in Ethiopia, there was villagization, where people were removed from one end of the vast empire to another end. Rastafari has remained relatively unmoved in Shashamane, which His Imperial Majesty gave as a gift of land to those who wanted to return to Africa from the West. part of his royal land, Shashamani, was donated for that reason. And this is where the repatriation trend has been. So we see Shashamani in great regard, and perhaps his example has prompted leaders of African nations to follow his example and allot spaces within their countries for the return not only of Rastafari, but of all African descendants who want to return to the homeland from which they were ejected by force and became enslaved in the West for several centuries. So the great reversal is repatriation, or rematriation, as it is called sometimes, by those who think, well, you know, there's father repatriation, but there's mother rematriation, or mother is Africa, so we can change the words. We are a progressive movement, and part of that progress is in finding words to describe the new situations we find ourselves in, or the progressive situations that we address. So we have the first house, Nyahbinghi. We have the EABIC, or Bobo Shanti, who wear the turban and the robes, etc. We have the EWF, the Ethiopian World Federation, which is mainly a Rasta-led organization in this time. And finally, the 12 tribes of Israel, as they're popularly known. Most of these houses adopted a charter of the EWF. I think the 12 tribes adopted Charter 17, which means that they became branches of the great EWF. But what seemed to be more important was how they were known in the wider world within the Rastafari vision of mansions of Rastafari. And they have been adopted in countries from here to Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Japan, China, etc. Everywhere that the word of Rastafari and the followers of Rastafari have been. And there's no part of the world today that you will not find a community, perhaps, of Rastas singing the same song. As those brothers said, we all have to sing the same song. And we all have to think the same thought, because unity is so important that we must not only seek it, but achieve it, in fact. So there are Rastas everywhere that we go in life. And around them, they change the ways that people see things. Later on, we had perhaps the spread of singers and players who carried the message. Music is such an accessible tool of communication that you had, obviously, people like Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Bunny Wailer, the Wailing Wailers, spreading the word of Rastafari far and near, touring countries and singing like the psalms that David sang in his time many centuries ago about equal rights and justice and about moral reality, each person being responsible for his brother or his sister, peace being what we all sought in life, what we all seek in life, and it being able to be achieved in a world where Rastafari, the great king, has given us the weapons and the tools in our mind, in our hands, to achieve peace on earth. So we have shaken rulers. Today there's even a brother, Rastafari in Gambia, who has gone up for the presidency, and he has written his letter of resignation to say that he only needs 5 years if he is appointed. He doesn't want to stay in power for longer than that, like these old men of Africa that cling to power endlessly, surrounded by their family, their friends, their cronies, etc., etc., until they became despots, as if they owned the country, both now and forever, and would never be removed from their status as president. This brother says, times change. Everybody needs a chance to do better. And therefore, he only wants to get 5 years to do his best. Perhaps looking at the example of the president of Tanzania and what he was able to achieve in his short stay in power. So, we are looking on the good side of this history. It has negative sides, where we were stigmatized and ridiculed for our love of the sacred herb, perhaps. You know, Peter Tosh, who I was close to at one point of his life, when he was playing at the Rainbow in London, etc. We got to know each other. He was an assiduous performer. When I went to his hotel in Swiss Cottage, he was always practicing on his one-wheel bike with his pipe in his hand. He was a great defender of the herb, you know, legalize it, and I will advertise it. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see the day that it was legalized in Jamaica. But he is remembered, along with Bob and others, as protagonists for this herb that is now accepted by so many nations, that was first prescribed and outlawed and linked to the Rastafari movement as a drug and something used by criminals, etc., etc. Today it is accepted. Times change. Look at America offering people who take the COVID injection a spliff. This being done as a way to get more people to take the injection. An incentive, you get a spliff, marijuana, if you take this injection. The Rastafari movement sometimes doesn't follow suit. Perhaps doesn't think we should put strange things into our body that we don't know about, that we can't vouch for, that may have bad elements in them, that may make our system become different and change our DNA from its natural form that Jah gave us into something alien, robotic. So we are careful, but we are not anti-vax. We are not in a corner. We want to help those who disagree with us to reason, because reasoning is a form of Rastafari peacemaking, that we can come to an agreeable conclusion about things that we differ about. We reason. From the earliest days, Rastafari reasoned with the community and said, what do we think about this? Not only what do we think, but what do I think? Because we became so misused as a word, we. Who is we? That we use the I talk. We put I in front of the words that were perhaps English to give them a central meaning, a reference to us. And we spoke of ourselves, we still do, among ourselves as I and I. When we are talking to the wider multitude, we say we, because we want to reach out and not convert, but convince others of who we are and what we are about. we are about saving the environment. We are about peace on earth. We are about equity and justice for all, not just for those 1% in power, but for the ordinary man and woman on the ground, that they should not suffer the oppression that I and I have suffered over so many centuries, unlike any other nation. That now the United Nations has prescribed a decade, an international decade, IDPAD, for people of African descent, in order to attempt to right the wrongs that have been done for so many centuries. 2015 to 2024, we are in the middle of that decade, in the hope that by 2024, some of these wrongs should have been put right for the Rastafari movement. So, through the singers and players, the theme of Rastafari was caught on the airwaves of Britain, was caught on the airwaves of the Caribbean, converted many who, again, like the Ethiopians who came before, the Ethiopianism or the Ethiopianists, these were also in a state of mind that things would change, that there would be something new. And hearing the sounds of Rastafari, reggae music on the airwaves made them think, why not? Why not? They were attracted to this message, to this new song of liberty, of freedom, to this so-called cult at the time, as it was seen, towards this movement that was not so much as a religion, but a livity, a way of life, that we should love each other, that we should live in harmony with each other, that we should live in harmony with the earth, and that we should accept His Imperial Majesty, Jah Rastafari, as our Redeemer, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of Himself, light of this world. So here we are, repatriation. Today we have a world community of organizations that have perhaps gone past the formation of mansions, even though mansions still exist and still carry on their respective duties and responsibilities, each one being slightly different from the other, having a different theology perhaps. You know, whereas Nyahbinghi are very seen as very spiritual and breathing fire against Babylon. You know, Babylon must fall, chanting down Babylon around the fire of our congregations and our rituals, dances and drummings, etc., you know. All mansions use the drums.
Don't worry about it, Shango. Crack on. You're sounding really good. Thank you. You're sounding really good. Thank you.
Okay.
Just pull noise off. We can hear you fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah. And so even language we change to suit our meaning, to suit ourselves, to impart a new message, to bring others into the fold. Therefore, you'll find even those in South America, if they speak Spanish, they say yo, yo, I and I. Fortunately, we have been brought up by the colonials. And I say unfortunately, but fortunately in terms of language, we can use I and I, the same symbol, one and one, which suits our purpose. What happens to I man happens to the I. So I can see our brotherly and sisterly relationship immediately as I use these words, rather than me and you being distinct and different from each other, and therefore setting up our position from the very start. We changed it. We changed it from you and me to I and I. And this is what we use when we speak together, even today. We have organizations who have gone past the stage of mansions and become working activists, such as DARC, DARC, Diasporic African Rastafari Congress, IDOR, International Development of Rastafari, a new one called a New Rastafari Faculty of Overstanding. I can't find an easy way to say it, ANRFO. We've had the AARG in Shashamane in 2017, a great coming together of all African Rastafari gathering, where we had at least several African countries represented, coming together for the first time outside of the Caribbean, outside of the diaspora, in Shashamane in 2017, a very remarkable occasion which I was blessed to attend. And from there, the Rastafari Continental Council was formed, an association of Rastafari in Africa, which would meet annually, which have met annually since then in Ghana, in South Africa, every year in a different place, coming together to meet and exchange thoughts and trade with each other, etc. So much so that even African governments are now making overtures, coming to the diaspora and speaking head to head, realizing that we are one people and that it is time to come together as one nation and undo the wrongs that have been done to us for so many centuries by together force against neo-colonialism, which will never again befall our people, that we shall see Rastafari as the true Pan-Africanists who have not just taken on the logic of the thought, but embodied it by wearing their head long, wearing their hair long, as did Africans of Kenya when they protested the Mau Mau, as did priests, even of Ghana, Akofa Noche, the great high priest of the Ashanti, was a dreadlock. In Ethiopia, the monks who lived apart in the mountains of Ethiopia were also dreadlocks. So it is a sign of both priestliness and warrior spirit. We don't fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in high places. In other words, we fight against the concept of high and low, of one human being oppressing another, of one being high and many being low. We fight against that. We say that this is not fair. We are like little children. We can easily see this is not fair. So in all our ways, we fight to better this, to make friends, to make peace on earth, goodwill to all men and women. And what else can we say? Some of the older generation have now transitioned. They have gone to the realm of the ancestors. At one point, we didn't want to deal with death, because the movement was young and so alive that death was not part of it. Today, we cannot excuse ourselves and irresponsibly allow those who pass on to be taken care of by their families. So bodies like the NNC, the National Nyahbinghi Council of the UK, have been involved in finding ways, creating ceremonies for those who are passing on, to give them a farewell that is of a Rastafarian nature, that it is drums and songs and memories and incantations that send them on their way. And even now we are influencing African descendants to do that, not to be sorrowful about death, but to see it as part of the continuity of life, and seeing that those who have passed are still with us, even as our ancestors are still with us, even as those who have gone before us are still part of who we are today. And we revere them and we ask them to guide us, because again, this is part of our makeup. The reverence that we have for our forebears, the guidance that we take from them, and the honor that we give them because we know what they have been through, and they can help us to go through what we are going through. So we know that Ras Bonagees is no more. 2000. Prince Emmanuel passed in 1995. God also, those elders that we spoke about have all gone before us. We are perhaps the third and the fourth generation of Rastafari carrying on, you know. And we have a saying, Jah not dead, you know, as Bob Marley said, Jah live, you know, forevermore. Because how can we honor a dead God? It would be useless. But if he is within us, driving us, guiding us, seeing us through every difficulty that we face, then surely he is, you know, as it was said by Moses, I am the I am. As it is said in Revelation, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And much of him is written in Revelation. And there are quotations that led the elders of the movement to find him in this sacred book, in which he himself said, I glory in the Bible. Just to read some of these quotes. Revelation is seen as the culmination of biblical prophecy, the last book of the Bible. It is regarded as the final reference point for the coming of a Redeemer in the end of days. And it is perhaps the primary source of information concerning the divinity of His Imperial Majesty. Revelation 5, verse 5. Quote, and one of the elders said to me, weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. Unquote. His Majesty is seen as the 225th descendant in line from King David, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. So this is what we find in Revelation 5. In Revelation 17, verse 14, he shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Revelation 19, verse 16. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of kings and Lord of lords. Revelation 22, verse 16. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star. Also, when we go to Psalms, in Psalms, we find a record of His Imperial Majesty. Psalm 18, great deliverance giveth he to his king, and showeth mercy to his anointed, to David and to his seed forevermore. Psalm 68, verse 4. Extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name, Jah, and rejoice before him, H-I-M in capitals, His Imperial Majesty. Again, Psalm 68, verse 31. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God. Psalm 76, verse 1. In Judah is God known. His name is great in Israel. Psalm 87. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia. This man was born there. Psalm 89, verse 35. Once have I sworn by my holiness that I will not lie unto David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. These are just a few quotes. There are a few more for you researchers of the Bible. Isaiah 11, verse 1, Isaiah 43, verse 3, Malachi 1, verse 14, Amos 9, verse 7, Nahum 3, verse 9, Daniel 7, verse 9. So these organizations such as DARC, D-A-R-C, IDO, International Development of Rastafari, both coming out of North America, a new faculty of overstanding Rastafari, activists on different continents, some in Ethiopia, Jamaica, America, and here in the UK, the All Africa Rastafari Gathering, Rastafari, the Majesty and the Movement, which I was honored to take part in, exhibition in 2014, which highlighted the works of His Majesty and the works of the movement that is named after him, done by different cohorts of Rastafari around the world and presented in Addis Ababa Museum in that year. We then returned to Britain, the few of us, 5 I think, who were involved in that exhibition, and presented it at the Bath Library at Birmingham, at the Black Cultural Archives in 2016, the 50th anniversary of His Majesty's visit to the Caribbean. We took the exhibition to Jamaica and showed it in West Jamaica, next to an exhibition called Rastafari at the time. By this time, we call it Rastafari in Motion. And it was featured for at least 2 weeks, or as we say, 2 strongs, at a venue in West Jamaica, where Rastafari came from, Montego Bay, etc., where Marcus Garvey came from, where Bob Marley came from. A very important section of Jamaica that has not seen the light of fame, such as Kingston has, but we remained in West Jamaica. A group of us found in the Congress or the gathering of 1983, the famous gathering was held in Jamaica in 1983. It was proposed that a global Rastafari secretariat should take care of the administration of the movement. And we thought it was time, over 30 years had passed, that we should revive this thought of Rastafari. There was Ras Jabulani from South America, Ras Steve from Barbados, myself originally from Trinidad, Ras Robbie, or Dr. Robbie Shilliam, who was a lecturer in Queen's University, Britain, before he transferred recently to Johns Hopkins University in the United States. International politics is his sphere of study. Ras Tafari, a publisher, musician, poet. Ras Ray, Webley Productions in video, etc. Ras Flacco Tafari, Elder Rastafari from Jamaica, and a sister who sadly passed a year later, but who we remember fondly, Sister Anita Robinson, at whose place we stayed while we were celebrating that 50th anniversary of His Majesty's visit to the Caribbean. And we attempted, as we are still attempting to do, to revive the Rastafari Global Secretariat, and to inspire others perhaps to come together to form this overarching body that would see after the administration of the movement, so that that unity, which is the Imperial Majesty told us about, could become a reality, and we could have much more impact on the world community than we already have today, when all communities in different parts of South Africa and Brazil and Japan and Poland and the UK and Europe, etc., have already had this impact on the communities in which we live. So, we started off with Ethiopianism, which preceded the coming of Rastafari as a movement. We saw that different activists in the Caribbean and in the Americas had furthered the cause of seeking Ethiopia, bringing it into liberation theology that would help us escape this feeling of the aftermath of slavery that had perhaps left us without identity and without strength. The main forces in Rastafari became an acknowledgement of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie, and a movement towards repatriation. And this was perhaps a common point of contact with all the mansions of Rastafari. We saw that the singers and players were able to spread the message of Rastafari by their lyrics and by their songs, and attract a very young generation seeking to create perhaps a new world beyond the wars of the 20th century. Perhaps a new thing could happen, something beyond religion that became a way of life that perhaps combined the best in all religions and made the world a safer place to live in, to celebrate. And then we find the coming together of activists in different parts of the world, even using the new technology to benefit the world community of Rastafari, which represents perhaps the poor people of Earth and their fight against oppression by the few, and to bring forward that impact that we have had into the 21st century and into the future, as it were. But I'm sure that the chairperson should be rapping me and telling me that I have said enough and should make room for questions and feed forward and reasoning.
Give thanks. I think that's a perfect kind of closing. I see some questions coming through. I have a lot of questions as well, but I am also conscious of time a little bit. So I'm going to head straight into the questions that we have, and definitely encourage those of you that want to ask anything to do so. One of the questions says, does I imply that in some way a Rasta is divine?
I think, we are all divine. We should see ourselves as divine rather than leave it to the angels and the saints, etc., etc. I don't think I means that we are divine. I think I says that I am the same as the I. So even without seeing the chairperson, I can feel her vibes. Shut up, Shango. You've said enough. And we can reason with each other. We can feel for each other. When we say the I, we mean not just my ego or myself or my personality or my character, but my link. I link with the I. And that's a peaceful situation, because if we are one and one, as we say sometimes, I. So I think we should not put away divinity, but embrace it. We are sons of a divine Father, so divinity rests within us. Next.
The next question says, how important was the UN to His Imperial Majesty and His Imperial Majesty to the creation of the UN and the Declaration of Human Rights? And do Rastafari consider the UN with the same importance in the role of establishing the ideals of peace, oneness, and international morality on Earth, aka Zion?
Yes, good question. As you know, His Imperial Majesty brought the case of Ethiopia versus Italy, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, to the League of Nations, which existed at that time for that reason, so that it would be an international court for disputes between nations. And the League founded on the question of Ethiopia's invasion. In other words, it couldn't come to a decisive agreement, and it was found not fit for purpose. And the UN was then formed on the basis that it would be better, greater, more capable than the League of Nations, which was its predecessor. And it is said that His Majesty not only guided, but helped to write the Constitution of the United Nations, knowing that it would be a force for good in the world, a force, even though imperfect, for having an effect on any dispute between nations that could be resolved by an international body. So yes, it is founded on principles that are the same as Rastafari: peace and love, unity, peace between one and one, the same as the OAU, which is now the African Union, is founded on the same principles. And we see ourselves as being part of that international movement that seeks peace between countries, nations, man and woman and child all over the world. So yes, we are part of, sometimes we are the United Nations on the ground, whereas the heads of government, etc., compose the international body. We have to do His Majesty's work on another level. And sometimes the Rastafari movement is interacting with these international bodies to make ourselves better known, to make them adhere to the basics and principles on which they are built. And we follow in His Majesty's footsteps. So we honor the UN in its resolve and its impact on international morality. As His Majesty says, you know, in Bob Marley's song, you know, until the color of a man's skin or a woman's skin is of no difference than the color of self, until men and women are seen to be equally distinct and equally important in the eyes of nations, until international morality takes hold of us all and makes us come to right decisions, we Africans will fight and we will win, because we are confident of the victory of good over evil, which is a thought of Rastafari from the beginning. David will conquer Goliath. Okay, give thanks.
Thanks. We have another question as well that says, what does the I say to some in these times who choose to burn the Bible?
We say very simply a quotation from His Majesty, that He glories in the Bible and that it is such an important work and a bulwark, something that bolsters our knowledge of life, that He has been steadfast with it throughout His life. And we too cannot really burn the Bible, not because His Majesty says it is so important in His life, but because it is so important in our own life. You know, it is a book that represents the earliest teachings of man, coming from times before the Bible. And even though there were 42 commandments at one time, by the time of the Bible, there were 10 commandments. By the time of Rastafari, there was just one love, you know. So from the Alpha to the Omega, the Bible from Genesis to Revelation makes sense of life itself in all ages. Can't burn the Bible. Burn Babylon.
And we have another question that says, what does Livity feel like?
Livity feels like what we do naturally in life. In other words, instead of religion being something separate from life that we do on a Sunday and dress up and go to church, etc., Livity is introducing religion into a commonplace, everyday something that we live, you know. We do good to our neighbor, to our brethren, to our sister, to our friends. We think positively, progressively. We search out solutions to all questions, to all matters. If we don't want to vaccinate, we spread a thought about why not let's all become immune in our minds and in our eating, etc., rather than burn each other and say, yeah, take vaccination, you're Rasta, you're bowing to Babylon. Rather than have this conflict constantly, we find ways beyond it and around it and over it. And we encourage others to do the same. And we reason about what we should do rather than find fault with those who are not doing what I do. Okay.
Thanks. We have also another question. We've got quite a lot of questions, actually, which is good. Keep them coming. How much, from the eye's perspective, have you witnessed over the decades a conspiracy against His Majesty to erase His Majesty from world history?
Yes. His Majesty and his thought process is mirrored in Rastafari. In the same way that they can't erase Rastafari from world history, whether the Majesty or the movement, is because we have identified the evil that there is in perhaps what can be called imperialism, the life of Western colonialism, all these isms that tend to dominate people and nations and bring impoverishment, lack of opportunity, etc. We are against these things. So I represent the oppressed of earth, and therefore I find ways to set examples, to incentivize others to become as I are. You know, we are confident of the victory of good over evil. Most ones aren't. They see evil as a great big monster, a great big Goliath standing up in front and boasting, beating his chest, you know. But Bob Marley once said in an interview when he was passing through the Caribbean at a radio station, he said, John will come for beat him chest and say, I am God. It is for I to see him for who he is. So let us be humble. You know, let us be like others rather than try to impose ourselves. You know, let I be like the I. Give thanks.
And then we have somebody that is saying, you referenced Bob Marley regarding a number of points. Bob Marley was baptized into the Ethiopian Orthodox faith after many years of inquiry and consideration. Haile Selassie, a direct descendant of King David through his son King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, along with his ancestors, were all faithful Orthodox Christians to the end. Haile Selassie wished for all his fellow Africans to come to the Ethiopian Orthodox faith, which he considered to be the one true faith. He sent priests to Caribbean to bring all the faith. Would appreciate you to share your thoughts on this with much love and respect.
Yes, give thanks. A very good point. I was wondering when it would come up. Yes. Yes, His Majesty celebrated and was head of the EOTC, the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox Church, and therefore he would have spread this message throughout the world that his followers, or Africans generally, remember Ethiopia was not just a place, a land, but at one time connotated the whole of Africa. So to say Ethiopian World Federation or Ethiopian Orthodox Church is something that resonates across the world, not just Africa, not just Ethiopia. So enough respect to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church of His Majesty, because it is a broad church with many, much knowledge is in it. I think His Majesty is also celebrated in its liturgy, that even if we don't join the OTC, we should be aware of it. I have a book which I'm reading at the moment that says something about the church, and I will read it much more studiously. But I think that His Majesty would also be pleased that we are Rastafari, that we are taking his name to the next level, or maintaining his earliest name, which we have taken as a point of contact with redemption, and that he would not necessarily force us to uptake membership of the EOTC, but certainly to regard it with honor and with respect, and to learn from it as best I and I can. Give thanks.
Give thanks. I'm just looking to see if we have any more. Okay, no, that's not a question. I do have a question before we close. I was conscious of not taking over. Give thanks for the wonderful kind of reasoning, Ras Shango. One of the things that kind of stood out to me the most is these questions of time, especially, relating to the topic of history and theology. But particularly what you said something early in your talk about, this idea of a slave rebellion, Rastafari being this slave rebellion continuing into the 20th century. And I'm interested to hear a little bit more about time, or often referred to as Iwa, because in my understanding, time is always attached to this concept of eternity. So I'll be interested to see how you feel, or if you can expand a little bit on the relationship between Rastafari and these questions of time, because I think it particularly relates to thinking about, the forms of cultural resistance in the dread talk, the dreadlocks, and this culture of liberation, centering this question of time, if that makes sense.
Yes. But I think, in a sense, you're answering it, because resistance is a force against time, or is a force in time. We have Black Lives Matter, for instance, which kind of exploded because of the murder of George Floyd, and took up an international protest. For the first time in our history, people of African descent were seen as victims. We shouldn't see ourselves as victims, perhaps, but it is good that the word matter has been put together with Black lives, which were seen as disposable. We were seen as chattel as for centuries. So it matters. And today, ones are seeing, well, yes, all lives matter. All the lives that are trodden under matter, in fact, and should be appreciated, loved. And we see ourselves not just coming from 1930 or even before Ethiopianism, because Rastas would tell you, as in, is it Bunny Wailer who says, we are from ancient time, trotting on through creation. I and I extend even to Moses, to the Israelites who suffered under the Pharaoh. And we are extending it to all suffering people because we have gone through this massive deprivation of identity, of self. We were reduced to chattel slavery, which means we were seen as not quite human, not quite deserving to be even on the last rung of the ladder. But we chant a royal chant. We chant from the highest level, you know. So from the heights to the depths, from the earliest until now, we encompass time within ourselves. We are those ancient heroes who have never passed away or translated because their souls are within us. Their lives are what I and I remake, recreate, etc. So the I and I is not just for the I and I, but also for all those in time who have gone through the same process of dehumanization, that I and I can rise above it. And, you know, after one love is one time. Yes. Let's be timeless.
Yeah. Give thanks, Ras Shango, for the wonderful. I mean, I wish we, on the concept of time, I wish we had more time to kind of delve in, because I for sure had a lot more questions that I might just take off air. But for the moment, give thanks for the wonderful reasonings and lectures. I, for one, have learned so much. I have taken so much notes throughout. Just to say to everybody that the next event as part of this festival is taking place on Saturday the 17th of July. It's going to be a special opera, so do check it out. But in the meantime, I'd just like to big up all of the organizers for this event and all of the funders. Let me make sure that I get it right. The Freedom in the City, the Fairfield House, Imperial Voice Radio, University of West of England, supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And a big special thanks to Jennifer, Bunny, and Dr. Sean as well for organizing. And also big, massive thank you to you, Ras Shango, for sharing space and knowledge. And, you know, knowledge is, for me, is the key. So keep up the, you know, to the festival organizers, keep up the upful works, look out for the more events. It's been a pleasure sharing this space with you and everybody, and give thanks for those of you who's been sharing your comments and reflections in the comment box. We are 18 minutes over, but definitely it's been upful works. Thank you.
Give thanks.
Give